Have you ever been to Texas? I've been to Texas, Austin, in fact. Fistful of years ago. It was a short trip and I was on a job, so we had a busy schedule, so I didn't get to do much touristy stuff. But I remember the people were friendly, the city was kind of culturally active and warm and open, and the food was fantastic. Chances are, if you've heard someone mention Texas recently, especially over the last few weeks, it's been in reference to their government, and in particular, the conservative governor, Greg Abbott, trying to demonize and in fact effectively criminalize supportive care for and about certain kinds of children. I'm not going to deconstruct it. I'll assume and hope I'm not the first voice you've heard on this issue, and I'm not even going to talk about it directly in this video. Instead, I'm going to tell you a very personal story that has nothing to do with gender identity, nothing to do with personal politics or the so-called culture war. Instead, I'm going to share two stories about my childhood, and in doing so, hopefully shine a light on the real issue at the core here. Why giving kids support and access to information, knowledge, and sharing with them stories of personal lived experiences can and will save their lives. And how keeping kids ignorant is abusive, hostile, and is directly responsible for killing children. Provocative language choice, I know, but I'm only using the same weapon as the people seeking to poison this issue are using themselves. Won't somebody think of the children? Hello again, I am Blunty, and I would appreciate it very much if you'd listen to everything I have to say here. I genuinely want you to think about it honestly and openly. I won't be tolerating bad faith arguments in the comments in the down below. I'm interested in communication, but I'm not interested in bad faith language games that so often bubble up with this kind of stuff and do everything they can to disrupt and distract from an honest and open dialogue about the issue. It's going to be a long one, so strap in. Hopefully you've got the attention span for it. So, I made a large series of notes on the topic of this video a few weeks ago. I tried to record something. At the time, I was on the tail edge of a depressive episode. I wasn't concentrating properly. I messed up the recording. I didn't have my microphone turned on, and I didn't have the energy to try again. I burned up everything I had that day in the one attempt to get that video recorded. Some of you know this, I'm open about it, but it doesn't come up very often in my YouTube videos because it's kind of a walk away from the most common content that I make. But I am bipolar. That's a term that's quite misunderstood by people who've never encountered it before and never needed to learn about it. It's also sometimes called manic depression or manic depressive disorder. But the medical term is bipolar disorder. It's a mental health disorder that causes unusual shifts in my overall mood. It can dramatically affect my energy levels, my ability to focus and concentrate, and can be very, very disruptive to my ability to function within normal daily tasks and routines. There's no single identified cause, there's no cure. Some people respond very well to various kinds of treatments and medications, and some people don't. And I'm one of the few who kind of have to deal with it the hard way because the medication didn't do the trick. Now, as I mentioned in the opening, this video is and is not talking about something the opponents of which have been calling the Don't Say Gay bill. Its intent is to literally block people like teachers from even so much as discussing LGBTQ issues and topics of gender identity, events or people related to these topics, and in fact go so far as to require teachers, parents, friends of parents and otherwise to report any attempt to support a queer kid, in particular the trans kid, as child abuse. This kind of information suppression, this kind of chill factor stuff is just the most violent, dangerous kind. It's going to kill children. We know this for a fact. We know this because there have been studies demonstrating that queer kids who get information, who get care, who get support, and are treated like people are significantly less likely to kill themselves as kids who don't have any support structures around these issues. The percentage is 40% less likely. So it is morally repugnant to suppress and punish information of this kind from children who literally may need it just to survive their childhoods. And people like Greg Abbott are examples of deep and horrifying ignorance that must be cured, because the only alternative to ignorance is it's a deliberate and hateful and demonstrably poisonous act of cowardice and malice so sickening people behind it should be removed from influence and power forevermore, especially in regards to childcare and education. So with that set up, let me tell you my stories. A story about how information and open and honest discussion of minorities like trans kids or the gays or any number of other minorities that will come next, because it will never stop with just one group. History teaches us this. It never stops with just one victim group. One of the divergent things about me as a person includes being bipolar. It's an absolute bitch of a thing, but it's also an indelible cog in the machinery that is me. It's not something that I caught. It's not something that was caused by my upbringing or by the kinds of comic books that I read or the music I listened to. And while it can be triggered or exasperated by external factors, its overwhelmingly largest factor seems to be genetic. I was born this way, if you will. Though for many, it doesn't start to manifest until puberty to their late teens. When I'm in a depressive swing, it's not just feeling sad, and no amount of exercise or funny movies or hanging out with my friends will magically snap me out of it. Depression and feeling sad and just being in a bad mood are not the same thing. Even from the outside looking in, it might look similar. It's different, fundamentally different. It's also a lifetime thing. I wasn't properly diagnosed until I was in my late 20s. And even then, I wasn't correctly diagnosed at first because there are other things that complicate it in my case. It makes it harder to pinpoint. One of those complicating factors is that I'm also on the autism spectrum. A very different issue, but each can have influences on the other. My heightened emotional empathy, for example, from the autism. Autism for me makes it sometimes extremely hard to regulate my emotional reactions. And as you may imagine, if you stack that with a mood disorder like bipolar, well, things get a bit tricky when they work against each other or even with each other. Both conditions have inherently and intrinsically deeply affected my life, who I am, and how I deal with the world and people. They colour my perceptions, they affect how I filter information and sensory input, my emotions, my moods, my ability to and methods of interacting with other people, and the way people react to me and treat me. I would literally have been a completely different person without them. They've affected me that deeply. They're that core in my being. And unfortunately for me, both conditions were undiagnosed and thus effectively stealthed to me until I was 27. As a kid, I knew I was different. I could easily see the ways in which my experiences and behaviors did not align with what was considered normal. And I had no idea why. I had no idea why I found certain things so much easier and more sensible and logical than other people seemed to be able to, or why they failed to see the simple things that I saw, and why it was so hard to get them to understand it or even notice it in the first place. It shone to me like a beacon. On the other hand, I had no idea why I found other things so impenetrably frustrating and difficult. Things other people just did, seemingly on autopilot, like small talk at parties, places where the people and the noise and the lights and the chatter and the laughter of dozens of people having dozens of different conversations, and the music and the clattering of glassware and bottles made it next to impossible for me to focus on anything, even the conversation happening in front of me. And why would I even goddamn care about the weather? What the hell kind of response are you expecting from me? Because I already know that talking about atmospheric pressure fronts and how they influence cloud formation and the rainfall isn't what you're expecting as a response here. Because I've been there, I've tried that, and I've seen the baffled faces it provokes. If you didn't actually want to talk about the weather, then why did you bring it up? I've got things about the weather I could tell you, and you're just confused. While the autism thing, with the benefit of hindsight, affected me as far back as I can remember, the bipolar thing, as is common, didn't rear its head until puberty-ish. The point, though, in me telling you this, is to communicate that everything bipolar disorder and autism affected about me for the first quarter century of my life, every last one of my formative years as I grew into adulthood to find my place in the world and to become the man I wanted to become, had no useful context for me. I had no goddamn idea why I was so different. And the older I got, the more people would notice how different I was. I had no help with it, no support, no tools, no backdrop, no framing devices, nothing that could have helped me navigate the nightmare, and nothing that could have helped other people see me, like properly be seen, to be properly understood, properly and honestly ground up, understood and seen as a person. As a kid, I had immense trouble figuring out socialization. I didn't know other people didn't have the same experience figuring it out, so I didn't talk about it, I didn't ask about it. All I knew was they were working it out and I wasn't. I was sure sooner or later I would figure out the trick to it. I knew I wasn't stupid. I knew lots of things about lots of things, and I always scored the top of the class when we did like trivia and stuff. Well, not always top of the class. There was a girl called Lisa. She was tiny and so smart. Smarter than me, probably. Easily probably smarter than me. Certainly better at math than I was, but she didn't struggle with socialization like I did, so it wasn't just being smart that set me apart. But I was still constantly frustrated by the behaviors and reactions of people around me. I couldn't connect how they did to other people. I felt isolated, I felt disconnected, I felt misunderstood. I was mocked and bullied for the ways in which I was different. So I withdrew. I started spending my recess and lunch breaks hiding in a quiet little corner or two that I'd found, or sometimes just walking a nice preset path around the schoolyard. And I walked with purpose so other kids would think I was going somewhere to do something. But I wasn't. I just walked in loops, hoping not to stand out as being alone. Sitting somewhere alone only drew attention. I'd already learned that. Other kids and teachers would come up and ask why I was sitting alone, or worse, they would deride me for it, mock me for it, tease me for it. I had exactly one friend in primary school, but we only hang out really after school and at weekends because at school, he likes sports, team sports. Not really my bag. In high school, I started to figure out some scripts, some routines that made social stuff flow a little bit better. I made a few more friends, I had conversations, I tried to fit in, but it was still hard. There were times I'd do or say something that clearly the others weren't expecting, and I'd get baffled looks or get called weird. I still spent a lot of my lunch hours alone as well, or in the library, sitting in a dark, quiet little corner of a stairwell that I'd found. It was perfect, dimly lit, very quiet, as it was a long way from where most kids would spend their lunch, and it was surrounded by two big, heavy, fireproof doors, which were very good at sound dampening. And that was fantastic. I loved that spot. It was perfect, quiet, cool, dark, beautiful. Until some kids made it the makeout spot because they figured out teachers rarely patrolled there, which is why I liked it, because I wouldn't be bothered. So I'd have to fall back and spend my lunch doing laps of the schoolyard again, pretending I had places to be. I had a lot of what in parent-teacher meetings and on the letters sent home were called behavioral difficulties. I was suspended at least a couple of times every single year of my high school experience. I even got expelled once. In autism, there's a phenomenon usually called a meltdown, shorthand for an excessive or extremely intense reaction to something that has been making us anxious or feel overwhelmed. One of the things that people with autism commonly have issues with is filtering sensory input, dumbed down at basically, it can be very hard to process everything that we're feeling, hearing, seeing, or otherwise experiencing going on around us. And sometimes our ability to tolerate or cope with that kind of snaps. We hit a limit, and it's a hard limit. The Hollywood cliche of a meltdown looks like a child's temper tantrum, screaming and thrashing around, and you've seen it in movies. And that is true for some autistic people, but not for all of us. Probably not even for most of us, really. For me, I usually lose all ability to emotionally regulate, which could mean a fit of undirected rage, in my case more vocal than physical, or it could be crying or some sort of extreme agitation. From the outside, it kind of looks like I've just snapped into a fury for no reason after holding something in, perhaps. You know, well, what pushed him over the edge? He's got anger issues. Usually, I'll often transition quickly from that meltdown state into a shutdown, which is a related phenomenon where my brain just kind of self-protects. My world gets very small and I can't and won't respond to other people, even loved ones, desperately trying to help. I'm literally locked up, curled up, usually completely focused on one thing, a spot on the floor, a coin in my hand, something, anything, one thing, so I can shut everything else out. Just focus on this thing. We experience meltdowns or shutdowns in a completely involuntary reaction. We can often feel it coming, which many call the rumble stage. I like that term. But there's often little that can be done to stop it once that happens. If we notice the rumble stage early enough, separating ourselves from the space we're in can often help a bit, sometimes even prevent a meltdown altogether. If you've ever hung out with me at a convention, for example, and you've ever seen me abruptly pop out of a group to leave, I leave the main hall, I go sit somewhere quiet, that's me feeling the rumble and trying very hard to avoid a meltdown in public by removing myself from the overwhelming environment on the show floor in favor of somewhere more open and quiet where I can just sit and decompress for a moment. So the point here is self-awareness and knowing what my autism is doing, how it's affecting me, and having the right knowledge and having the right tools at hand to help me cope with, avoid, reduce, or deal with the more severe aspects is an extremely powerful thing. And I did not have that as a younger man or a kid. Let me take you back to my high school experience, year 8. When the vice principals tried to stand in my path as I was lost in a rage, the 5th time I can remember a rage this severe and unfocused and intense, what I now see in hindsight as an autistic meltdown, but back then, no idea. I was storming through the schoolyard, knowing that if I stopped, if I stood still, if someone got in my way, I would lose the very last ounce of my self-control. I'd been through this before. I was trying to avoid violence. I only had one tool. I had no idea why I would get so angry or what to do with it. And it was so intense and so overwhelming, it shut down my ability to talk with any eloquence for some reason. I didn't understand that either. So angry I can't talk properly. All I knew is I had to burn it off, and better to do that walking than to aim it at somebody. The vice principal didn't understand that. How could he possibly? What possible frame of reference did he have for my behavior? What he saw was a kid with a history of behavioral difficulties storming around like he was looking for a fight. So he intervened. I begged him to get out of my way, or at least I tried. The words were hard to form. I screamed at him at the absolute top of my voice to stand clear of my path. I was shaking, my jaw muscles pulsed, my breathing was shallow and fast, my heart was racing, my eyes felt hot. I was burning up from the inside, and all I wanted to do was keep walking until it went away. He didn't understand. His duty was to protect the other kids from me, as he saw it. Except I wasn't looking for a fight. I was desperately trying to avoid that. I was doing the only thing I knew how to avoid that. But I had no way of making him understand. By now my words wouldn't form anything but hissing, "Get out of my fucking way!" through clenched teeth. And then I broke. No words left, only rage and fear and screaming. He tried to physically restrain me, and as his hands clamped around my upper arms, I punched him so hard under his ribs that both of his feet left the ground and he crumpled onto the dirt. I was, of course, expelled for this and sent to a tiny one-building school, a place where they send delinquents. I learned leatherworking there and got the high score on the pinball machine. But after one term there, they let me back into my normal school. None of my old friends would even talk to me for weeks after I came back. They wouldn't even look me in the eye at the bus stop. They'd been warned by the parents and other teachers to stay away from me. I was the bad influence, you see. What I now recognize as autistic meltdowns were then attributed to me being a bad seed, a kid with anger issues, violent, unpredictable, dangerous, uncontrollable, to be avoided. And that was far from my last meltdown, but it was at least the last one for a very long time that got physically violent, at least with anything except inanimate objects. Pillows are great. Back when I was a kid, a teenager, we weren't taught about mental health, not properly. The best we got was kind of an infantilized down talk about self-esteem and that feeling crappy about yourself is the wrong way to feel. You see, because we're all special in our own way and we should feel good about how we're special. But we're given no tools, no help, no structure, no context for any of that. Just say, don't feel bad, that's the bad way to feel. And hey, it turns out, by the way, if the way in which you are special makes other kids confused and uncomfortable and frightened of you, well, I guess it's a big bowl of fuck you, good luck with that for breakfast. Part of this complete breakfast, as a matter of fact, along with a slice of toasted men do not cry and a tall frosty glass of cheer up, things can't be that bad. Turn that frown upside down. In grade 6, back in primary school, we were asked to come up with a project idea. It could be about anything. It just had to be something we personally found interesting. That was the brief. I chose schizophrenia. I had just learned about it from randomly reading pages from an encyclopedia. Yes, that's really a thing I did for fun. Dork! I chose it because every time I'd heard the term, till then, either in real life or on TV or whatever, it was always in the context of split personalities. Schizophrenia equals split personalities. But I discovered schizophrenia isn't that at all. People were using the word wrong all of the time. I was very excited at this discovery. I was excited to help explain to my teachers and classmates what schizophrenia really was, and that they should stop using the term interchangeably with split personalities. They were using it wrong, and that they should stop using the word schizo as a way to tease people, because actually the disorder was, well, I don't remember what grade I scored. I do cleanly remember the baffled looks and confusion and the judgment. Every other kid in that class, you see, made projects about something that I considered vapid, like their favorite sports team, or pointlessly regurgitating something we were just taught about a few weeks back, like the water cycle or erosion. But here's the weird kid with his project all about a serious and life-altering mental illness, a condition that no one had ever met seemed to actually understand, something that people were terrified of because of their ignorance. I thought I was doing an amazing thing. I went out and I learned, and I tried to share what I learned to crush ignorance. I thought I'd be praised for my work. I thought I understood the assignment. My teacher hit her bafflement and fear poorly. I was teased for it by the other kids. There was laughter, sneering, whispering. I had a hard enough time already whenever I had to stand in front of the class to present whatever it was. At least normally the class was generally disinterested, as kids tend to be. I keep my eyes down, read what was asked of me, off my little sheets and stuff, and then go back to my little corner of the classroom. But this was a fresh hell. I was exposed. Every pair of eyes was on me now. Freak, weirdo, do you hear voices? Are you a schizo? Is that why you picked such a weird project? What a psycho. Psycho, psycho, psycho. That nickname managed to stick, lucky me, between my angry outbursts, in hindsight meltdowns, and this sudden consuming obsession with a crazy disease. Well, kids will be kids, as they say. I learned that day that talking about mental health in any way except using it as a weapon against someone wasn't a thing people did. I shut down a lot after that day. Shit was already hard, but now instead of going unnoticed as much as possible, people started noticing me. Now they saw just how different I was because they were paying attention. Several people from my primary school, of course, came to my high school, same local area, Doi, and with that came the stories they'd spread about my meltdowns. Did you hear about Blunty? He was at the nut house. He was in juvenile hall. I was being drugged up with antipsychotics so I wouldn't hurt anybody. It was in high school that the bipolar stuff started to manifest as well. I thought it was just normal teenage angst shit. Everyone goes through this. I've seen movies and TV about angsty teens feeling misunderstood and lonely and having emotional outbursts and crying in their rooms as they listen to the same song over and over and over again. Typical teenage stuff. So I didn't talk about it. I tried hard to shove everything different about me into a tight little ball. Just pass, just fit in, just say the things they expect you to say. Pick a football team so you have an answer when someone asks, who do you go for in the footy? And try to remember a few names from the team so you don't out yourself as not giving a single fuck actually about football. Just get through the agony of this stupid conversation like a normal person would. Shove it down. Don't talk about the sickening, chest-crossing anxiety you feel when asked to answer a question out loud in class, even though you know the damn answer. You knew the damn answer before it was taught to you. Don't show off how much you know about shit we haven't even been taught in class yet. That will make you stand out. And do not tell them where you really go at lunch and what you do with your time. Even when your friends ask, where were you at lunch? We were doing this. Just fit in, just pass, just get through the goddamn day without spazzing out at someone or saying something awkward. Shut up. When you're in a group, just make a pun every now and again. Just make a situationally relevant movie quote. So wordplay, association, it's easy for you. They'll think you're actually part of the conversation and won't call you the quiet, weird kid anymore. Why does it have to be like this? I can't figure out how to be normal. Why does acting this way feel so weird and unnatural? Why is it so hard to suppress this stuff? Everyone does it so easily. Look at them being normal. You're wrong. You're broken. They're right. You're a psycho. You can't hide it forever. Sooner or later, you will be exposed. Imposter, fake, psycho. It's too hard to keep this up. It hurts. It burns you up. It's exhausting. Why is this so hard? Why can't I just be normal like everybody else? You can't keep this up. No one could. You're not strong enough. It's too much. You know you're going to break, and then And then, and I've not even told you the worst stuff, the harder stuff, the stuff even 20 odd years later I still find too hard to talk about, especially exposing it to a bunch of internet randos. The point I'm trying to make is I was lucky to survive, and I mean that in a very literal way. The odds were not insignificant that I wouldn't, that I would make a different choice somewhere along the line, that I'd let my acts of self-harm escalate, like my cousin did. One of 3 people in my entire extended family I ever felt any kind of honest understanding and connection with. She didn't make it, and because we don't talk about such things, I never did know why. I have my suspicions, I can guess, but I'll never know. I never know if she'd still be around if we did talk about it, if it was okay to talk about it. What I do know is that knowledge is power, and since my own diagnoses, I've had much better success in being honest about who I am and what I am. Not always to other people. It was still pretty ashamed of it for a long time. There was still lots of stigma and misunderstanding around mental health stuff, so it's best to keep it to yourself. Not to mention how wildly misunderstood and patronizingly infantilized autism was seen by most, given the kinds of examples they were shown of it in TV and movies and whatnot. But at least now I had context for myself, and I had understanding, and I had some tools where once I had nothing, things were getting better. Still not easy, never will be. I'm not normal. The world makes few concessions towards that fact, and not being normal is actually fine. Normal just means rare, uncommon. A 4-leaf clover isn't normal either, but some people prize them. Not being normal isn't the same thing at all as being bad or even unwelcome or unworthy. And now, for example, given how in recent years more and more public discourse has happened about autism, more normal people understand it a little bit better. I have to hide and suppress a little less. Talking about it is easier. I can do small things just like be honest about why I have to leave a social situation instead of making up some BS white lie so I don't seem rude, or so I don't have to spend the next 5 minutes explaining autism enough for me to be able to leave that room without them thinking I'm being rude. All that crap, what autistic people call masking, pretending to be normal so other people aren't made uncomfortable, takes so much energy and so much willpower, and feels so untruthful and dishonest within myself, and not having to do it as much reduces the amount of anxiety I deal with tremendously. Queer folk have a similar thing, don't they? Pretending to be the way we aren't, saying and doing the expected normal things instead of the honest things we feel, and in that community it's called being closeted. I have better tools now to deal with things, better language for myself to use and to use with other people. Understanding myself and knowing how to help other people understand me has made a massive positive difference in my life. And it's only possible because people can talk about it now. Tremendous efforts have been spent over the last couple of decades or more destigmatizing mental health issues. Now people are actively taught about it. The representation in media is improving, and normal people have some useful framework and tools for understanding people like me. A lot of them are still quite imperfect, but it's a start. We're getting somewhere, and it's a foundation I and the people around me when I was a kid never had. As I stumbled through my formative years in the 90s, mental health wasn't talked about in any real way. The only context for it was shit in TV and movies, always showing how mental asylums were horrifying places. How many horror movies are set in a mental asylum, filled with dangerous and scary and aggressive, uncontrollable people, put there to keep you safe from them? That was largely the only example of any mental health state other than normal that I was ever exposed to growing up. Mental illnesses were something to be regarded with as much fear and doom as cancer, or indeed, as it was in the 90s, AIDS. If awareness was greater, if more truth was out there, if more discussion was happening, if more information about mental health was easy to get, better taught, if understanding rather than fear was the tool of education, I might not have come so close to self-destruction. My cousin, only 18 months my junior, may have survived. She might have thrived. She might have been amazing, or she might have just been happy. These days, I can tell people I'm bipolar without expecting them to instantly picture some sort of wildly flagellating, unpredictable, cackling maniac prone to spring from mood to mood at a moment's notice. Most people I meet either already know a little bit about it or have the language and tools for me to explain it to them in a few moments. They know at least about depression. Bipolar is only the next step in explaining that. Autism these days, too, is better understood, better supported, and more carefully diagnosed. Back when I was a kid, it wasn't even an official diagnosis in Australia. I had literally no hope. It wasn't until 2019 that there was even a nationwide standardized approach for consistency in diagnosing autism in Australia. If I were a kid today, now, chances are pretty decent I'd be correctly diagnosed, or at least on the right path to doing so. I'd have information, support, tools, educators, parents, media. There would be understanding, comprehension, and with that would come empathy, because understanding is required for empathy. If I'd been helped to understand why I feel how I feel and how I can learn to understand myself and myself in context in interacting with other people, and if the others around me had the right tools and knowledge, my childhood, without any stretch of the imagination, would have been vastly less traumatic for me and those around me. But I was alone, absolutely alone. No one understood me. No one helped me. They tried, of course, but they didn't have the right tools. And I had no way, I didn't have the words to explain to them in any meaningful way why I felt so broken and isolated, and I had no idea how I could even fix myself once I noticed no one else had any help for me. How am I supposed to fix myself? But I didn't need fixing. I wasn't broken, but I felt like I was broken. That's a horrific and dangerous way for a kid to feel. Alone, broken, and hopeless and helpless to all. And here is where I finally pull all the way back around to the opening. While mental health and issues around gender and sexual identity are not the same thing, and conflating them for some people is just another weapon of discrimination, still, many of the issues and challenges faced by kids being understood, in being seen, in understanding themselves and in being helped to do that, are the same. And the fix is the same as well, of course. Free, easy, open access to information, and not just access, but active education. We must teach this. We must talk about it. It is a moral duty to do so. If I had been taught what autism is, if I'd been able to put myself on a path of self-diagnosis and then to medical diagnosis, if education about it was broader, if my teachers had put my behavioral issues and socialization issues and communication issues in a puzzle, it would have helped. Instead, what I got was 6 weeks of speech therapy for my stammer, which was treated in isolation of itself and not in the context of being an intermittent and anxiety-triggered communication issue not uncommon in autistic kids. Information, context, knowledge is power, and wisdom from those who came before us with lived experiences are the Jedi Masters who command it most powerfully. We must listen to these people. And suppressing information, hiding it, withholding it, punishing it, in part or in full, from children or the family of children, the support structures of children, whose lives would be indisputably better if given the proper tools, not only is it morally repugnant, it is willfully abusive and will, I am in no doubt, lead to more kids self-harming or worse. I know this without a shadow of a doubt, with absolute crystalline clarity, because I lived through it in my own way. I just exposed you a couple of stories that showed you that. What is true for my mental health issues is just as true for queer kids trying to figure themselves out and talk about it with authority figures, with family, with loved ones, with friends, with peers. They need the right language. And so far, I've not even touched on my own sexual, romantic, and relationship to gender issues. And I did that deliberately because mental health is something pretty much everyone can relate to, either personally or through family or friends in one way or another, to varying degrees of severity and visibility. But it is easier for some people to feel empathy for those of us dealing with these kinds of things like bipolar disorder, clinical depression, even autism. It's a closer branch to grasp from the empathy tree for them. It is much more difficult for these people to comprehend what the lived experience of a trans kid is. Unless, of course, you try to help those kids and show them the same love, compassion, empathy, support that you would show any kid. More open and honest conversations, discussions, and fostering of mutual understanding can do nothing but make people's lives and the fucking world better. On the issue of my own specific relationship to my sexual and romantic identity, I was real late to figure that shit out too, because I wasn't exposed to enough information. I had no context. With the right information and hindsight, there are so many things I'd have happened in my personal relationships that would have and should have been better. There's things I used to put down to my autism or my mood disorder that are far better explained and confronted with the language and context from the queer communities. Words like grey asexual and panromantic. I'd wish I'd known decades ago. It would have uncomplicated a great many things in my life and perhaps saved me from some very painful regrets. It is unconscionable to me, for anyone, especially a country like the USA, that loudly prides itself for its freedom of speech, to maliciously and deliberately put their own children in danger like this by hiding information from them and punishing people who try to give that to them. Suppressing this information, hiding it from them, withholding it from them, punishing the people who try to give it to them won't magically stop these kids from being trans or gay or any flavor and combination of queer identity. Exposing them to this information won't magically turn them. Being queer isn't the same as being a werewolf, you dopey buggers. It's not how any of this works. And these fuckers know that's not how it works. And they don't care. They need an us versus them. They're addicted to being the oppressors, knowing that feeling of self-superiority, of imagined moral righteousness. These days, targeting the melanin-gifted type people is becoming quite a bit harder to politically justify or even weaponize. Heck, even the regular type cisgender gays are too tough of a target to treat as a threat to the system these days. So new enemies, more vulnerable enemies must be identified and invented and promoted to prime target status. Ask literally any queer person anywhere within the rainbow, especially those around my age, who grew up in the 90s, about how uplifting and liberating it felt the first time they found people and spaces that offered understanding, information, and dialogue instead of silence and willful ignorance. Watch them light up about that transformative experience. Ask them if their lives would have been better or worse before they felt free to openly talk about that side of themselves. Not a difficult question. Ignorance is not bliss, and making laws to keep children ignorant is a repulsive and carefully paved path to bigotry, to violence and oppression based on weaponizing hatred of a minority. These politicians are doing this to cultivate ignorance, to grow it like a poisonous vine, to drive these divergent people, these different people, into hiding where they're easier to victimize and harm and lie about. To keep them and everyone around them ignorant and suspicious, and to make themselves seem powerful, in control, dominant. The people who want bills like this, laws like this, are the violent danger to our communities, not the queers. These people are vile, hateful, unenlightened, petty, and they must at every turn be challenged and confronted and educated to the reality of the world and the people they are paid to serve. Because they will not stop at this measure. People like this never do. It's not this one thing and nothing more. Just the trans kids, I promise. They will not stop at suppressing information about these kids or spitefully harming people in their sad, pathetic ignorance and hate. They will use it to grow from. They must be questioned and they must be held accountable. And as much as I hate to close out with Godwin's law of all things, sometimes you've got to dumb it all the way down for some people. And it is fair to point out that Hitler did not campaign on a let's do genocide on all the Jews and disableds, because it never starts that big. You have to grow that kind of shit from a smaller vine first. And now my personal story has turned into a pantomime of a political speech, so I have to stop. Thank you very much for watching. If you did make it to the end of the video, hopefully you learned something interesting, or just found it, I don't even know what. I'm hot and I'm sweaty and I got really worked up in recording that. Hopefully the video is not too long for most people to watch, and hopefully what I wanted to say is communicated clearly enough. And hopefully you know how thankful I am for the patrons scrolling up above there. Thanks, guys. And good luck, Texas. And everywhere else that feels inspired by Texas. Such a pity. Austin really was quite nice.